I always believed that when I had something real to show for all those years of struggle, my family would finally stand beside me. I worked for more than a decade chasing that belief. I sacrificed comfort, stability, sleep, and sometimes even my pride. I told myself that if I kept going, if I built something undeniable, my dad would look at me differently. My mom would stop worrying about what people thought, and my place in the family would finally feel secure. I was wrong. They did not forget about me. They chose something else. That night was Christmas dinner, 2023. The table was full, plates still warm, glasses half filled. I remember the smell of roasted meat and cinnamon candles mixing in the air. Everyone was talking at once, laughter overlapping, forks scraping plates. Then my dad pushed his chair back so hard it scraped across the floor, and he stood up. He did not clear his throat. He did not smile. He raised his voice and yelled across the table that I had abandoned my sister when she needed me most. His words cut straight through the noise, sharp and loud, like something breaking. For a second, the room froze. My ears rang, not just from the volume, but from the way sound collapses for me when too many voices crash together. I have lived with mild hearing loss my whole life. The kind people say is not a big deal. In moments like that, everything turns muffled and distorted, like I am underwater and the world is shouting from above. My dad kept going. He said that after everything we did for you, you changed. He said family obligation meant something, that blood should come before money, that success meant nothing if you forgot where you came from. He said I was selfish. He said I had money now, but no morals. I looked at my mom, waiting for her to interrupt him, to say this was not the time or the place. She stayed silent, her hands folded in her lap, eyes fixed on the table. My sister did not say a word either. She did not defend me, and she did not deny what he was saying. She just sat there, staring at her plate. If you are listening to this right now, I am curious where you are. For me, I was sitting alone in my car later that night, parked a block away from their house, trying to catch my breath after everything exploded. Let me know in the comments where you are listening from and what you were doing when you pressed play. I did not argue with my dad. I did not raise my voice. I stood up, pushed my chair back carefully so it would not scrape, and I walked out of the house. I remember the cold air hitting my face, the sound of the door closing behind me, and the way my hands were shaking even though I felt strangely calm. 3 weeks later, my dad sued me. He filed a lawsuit demanding 50% of my company, claiming that I owed it to my family. The paperwork said I had failed my family obligation. It said my refusal to financially support my sister had cost her opportunities she deserved. It said my success existed because of the family I came from, and therefore belonged to them too. What the papers did not say was that this was not about my sister alone. It was about desperation. I will tell you everything that led up to that lawsuit, every choice and every silence that made it possible. I will tell you what happened in that courtroom, when the judge looked at the file, looked at my dad, and said one sentence that shattered him so completely he could not stop crying and had to leave the room. But before any of that, before the lawyers and the paperwork and the word entitlement entered my life in a bid, the way I could never unhear, you need to understand who I was to my family long before I ever had anything worth taking. I am 33 years old now. I live in Spokane, Washington. I run a technology company called Gray Line Systems, something I built from nothing after years of being told, directly and indirectly, that I was never quite enough. I was not the child my parents showed off. I was not the one they bragged about to friends. I was the one who learned early how to stay quiet, how to stand slightly out of frame, how to make myself smaller so other people could feel more comfortable. Growing up, my hearing loss was always described as minor, manageable, not something worth fussing over. And on paper, that was true. I could hear. I could speak clearly. I did well in school. But there was a difference between being able to function and being fully accepted. When the house got loud, when voices overlapped, I was always the one asking people to repeat themselves. I was always the one missing part of the joke. My mom used to tell people I was sensitive. My dad used to say I needed to toughen up. Neither of them ever said they were embarrassed, but they did not have to. I could feel it in the way photos were staged, in the way my sister was pushed forward while I was gently guided to the side. By the time I was a teenager, that dynamic was set. My sister was the future. She was the one with potential, the one whose dreams needed protecting. I was the one who would be fine, who could handle things, who did not need much. That belief followed me into the moment that changed everything. The night I was told to leave home, the months I spent sleeping in my car at 17, and the years I spent building a life that no one could control but me. All of that came before the lawsuit. All of it came before my dad decided that my success was something he could claim. And all of it explains why, when the judge finally spoke, it was not just a legal decision. It was the first time someone in authority saw the truth my family refused to face. That story starts long before Christmas dinner, long before courtrooms and filings. It starts with the child they could not show off, and the silence that followed me out the door when I was told I no longer belonged. The silence that followed me out the door when I was told I no longer belonged did not start that night. It had been forming for years, quietly, long before anyone ever raised their voice or asked me to leave. I learned early that my place in the family came with conditions, not rules written down, not punishments announced out loud, but expectations that floated in the air and settled on me like dust. Be easy. Be flexible. Do not draw attention. Do not make things uncomfortable. My hearing loss was always described as small, mild, manageable, nothing worth worrying about. That was the word my mom liked best, mild. She said it with a smile whenever teachers asked questions or relatives tilted, their heads a little too long. It became a shield she used, a way to dismiss anything that required adjustment. At home, it meant that when the television was loud and everyone talked over one another, I missed pieces of conversations. Jokes landed late or not at all. Laughter would erupt and I would laugh too, a second behind, hoping no one noticed. Sometimes I would ask someone to repeat what they said, and my dad would sigh and tell me to pay attention. At school events and birthday parties, the noise blended into a thick wall. My ears caught fragments, but my brain had to work twice as hard to stitch them together. I learned to watch faces instead of listening fully. I learned to read lips without realizing I was doing it. I learned to nod at the right moments. What I also learned was that my parents noticed all of this, even if they never named it. They noticed the extra second it took me to respond. They noticed the way I leaned in when someone spoke. They noticed how I sometimes stood slightly apart from the crowd, not because I wanted to, but because it was easier to manage the sound that way. They noticed, and they quietly adjusted me out of the picture. Family photos were the first place I understood that something about me did not fit the image they wanted to present. Every holiday, every birthday, every gathering ended the same way. Someone would call out that it was time for a picture. My sister would be guided to the center, hands smoothed over her shoulders, chin lifted just right. She always knew where to stand. I would step into the frame and feel a hand on my arm. Not rough, not angry, gentle, guiding. My mom would smile tightly and say, "Stand over there, just a little to the side." She said it softly, like it was a favor, like she was helping me. Once I stayed where I was and pretended not to hear. He leaned close and told me not to make it a thing. His voice was low, controlled, meant only for me. Then he smiled wide for the camera. In those pictures, you can always spot me if you know where to look. Slightly off center, slightly back. Not wrong enough to explain, but not right enough to be proud of either. My sister never had to move. She was always framed by attention. Bright dresses, confident posture, eyes already trained on the lens. Even as she knew how to hold a smile until the shutter clicked. She knew people commented on her constantly. How pretty she was. How outgoing, how she would go far someday. My mom soaked it up. My dad beamed. I stood listening. At family gatherings, cameras followed my sister like gravity. Phones lifted, flashes popped, voices called her name. She knew when to laugh, when to look serious, when to turn slightly sideways. I learned to step out of the way. There was one that still comes back to me when I think about how early this pattern set in. We were at a small local event, my sister was part of a performance. Nothing major, but she was on stage under bright lights, music playing, people clapping. My mom held her phone up the entire time, recording every second. The speakers crackled, voices echoing. I missed half of what was said. When the applause swelled, it felt like it hit me physically. A wall of sound pressing in. After compliments flew, photos were taken. Strangers stopped to say how talented she was. Someone asked my mom about me, standing nearby. She laughed and waved her hand and said I was just shy, sensitive, not a performer. No one corrected her. Later, when we were walking back to the car, I mentioned that I had not heard part of the announcement and asked what they had said. My dad told me it did not matter. My mom told me not to worry about small things. Those small things stacked up. At home, noise was constant. The television blared, music played from phones, conversations overlapped from room to room. When I asked to turn the volume down, my dad would ask why it bothered me so much. When I covered my ears or left the room, he said I was being dramatic. My mom tried to smooth things over by saying I was just sensitive. She said it to friends. She said it to relatives. She said it to the doctors. Sensitive became the word that explained everything without requiring anyone else to change. What it really meant was that the problem was mine alone. As we got older, the gap between my sister and me widened. She leaned into attention. I leaned away from it. She sought out noise and energy. I sought out quiet corners where I could hear myself think. My parents rewarded what they understood. When my sister spoke loudly and confidently, they praised her. When I hesitated or asked for clarification, they grew impatient. When she demanded space, resources, and support, they provided it. When I asked for understanding, they offered tolerance at best. I started to notice how often I was positioned behind her, physically and emotionally. In group settings, she stood forward, answering questions, telling stories. I stood back, listening, filling in gaps only when necessary. At dinners with friends of my parents, conversations flowed quickly. I caught parts of them, enough to follow the general direction, but not every detail. When I missed a joke, my mom would laugh and say, "Oh, you know how she is." My dad would change the subject. No one ever asked if the room could be quieter. No one ever slowed down their speech. The adjustment was always mine to make. I did not resent my sister for this. Not then. I saw her as part of the system, not its architect. She did what worked for her. She shined in the light she was given. I did not fault her for that. What hurt was realizing that my parents were making choices about which child fit, the story they wanted to tell. It was not that they disliked me. They took care of me. They fed me, clothed me, and made sure I went to school. But there is a difference between being cared for and being claimed. They claimed my sister. They managed me. The older I got, the more I understood that image mattered deeply to them. How the family looked from the outside. How we appeared in photos, in conversations, in public spaces. Anything that complicated that image was quietly pushed aside. My hearing loss complicated it. Not enough to demand action, but enough to require explanation. Enough to make people pause. Enough to disrupt the smooth narrative. So I was placed slightly out of frame. I remember one holiday gathering where a relative asked directly about my hearing. It was an honest question, curious, not unkind. Before I could answer, my mom stepped in and said it was nothing, barely noticeable, not worth talking about. She smiled as she said it. The conversation moved on. I stood there, invisible again. That was when it clicked for me. In a way I could not articulate at the time. I was not being rejected. I was being edited. They were curating a version of the family that felt comfortable to them, and I did not fully fit the aesthetic. So they adjusted my placement, my volume, my presence, until I blended into the background. The realization did not come with anger. It came with clarity. I stopped expecting to be introduced with pride. I stopped expecting to be centered. I stopped expecting my needs to matter in the same way. Instead, I learned to be capable, to be quiet, to be adaptable. I learned to handle discomfort without complaint. I learned to make myself small enough to avoid friction. That skill served me later in ways I could not have predicted. But it also taught my family something dangerous. It taught them that I could be shifted, sidelined, sacrificed without breaking. By the time I was a teenager, This role felt fixed. My sister was the one they invested in, the one they prepared for the future they imagined. I was the one they assumed would figure things out on my own. I do not think they ever sat down and decided this consciously. It was not a single conversation or a deliberate plan. It was a series of small choices, repeated over time, until they became reality. Looking back now, I can see how those choices laid the groundwork for everything that followed. The ease with which they dismissed my discomfort, the way they prioritized image over inclusion, the habit of moving me out of the way instead of making room. When my dad told me years later that I had changed, that I had become selfish, I thought back to those moments. The hands guiding me aside, the instructions not to make it a thing, the quiet expectation that I would always adjust. That was the child they could not show off. The child who learned early how to disappear just enough to keep the peace. And when the time came for someone to bear the weight of their choices, it made perfect sense to them that it would be me. I was 17 the night everything finally broke open. It was late summer in Spokane, one of those evenings when the heat hangs on even after the sun goes down. I had stayed at school to finish a project because it was quieter than home. When I walked through the front door, I could hear my dad's voice from the living room. He was not yelling, not yet, but there was a tension in his tone that made the air feel thick. My sister sat on the couch scrolling her phone, tapping quickly with her perfect nails. She barely looked up when I entered. My mom stood near the hallway, arms folded, watching my dad like she was waiting for him to set the direction of the night. He asked me where I had been. His voice was steady, but there was something sharp underneath. I told him the truth, that I had been working on a school project, that I had stayed up late to use the library computers. He stared at me long enough that I wondered if he even heard the words. He said I was becoming disrespectful. He said I had been pulling away. He said families had rules for a reason, and that if I wanted to live under his roof, I needed to follow them. I remember standing there, backpack still on my shoulders, feeling the weight of expectations I could never quite understand. I asked him what rule I had broken. He did not answer that question. He made a new one. He said that starting immediately, I needed to turn over half of every paycheck from my part-time job to contribute to the household. It was presented like a lesson in responsibility, but it was not about responsibility. It was about control. I tried to explain that I needed that money for school supplies, for bus fare, for food on days when I had to stay late. He waved it off and said if I could not manage my finances, he would do it for me. My sister smirked into her phone, not even pretending to hide it. I told him I could not do it. The words felt like stepping off a cliff. His face tightened. My mom looked down at the carpet. My dad said if I refused to follow the rules of this house, then I could not stay in it. He did not shout. He did not strike anything. He said it like it was the simplest fact in the world. He told me to pack a bag. He told me I could return when I was ready to comply. My mom walked into the kitchen. My sister kept her eyes on the phone. No one asked why. No one asked if I was scared. No one asked if I had somewhere to go. I went to my room and grabbed the small things I knew I could not lose. Notebooks, 2 changes of clothes, a phone charger, a bottle of water. I stood there for a moment, waiting for someone to stop me or even to speak. The house was quiet, except for the faint tapping of my sister's fingers on her screen. When I walked out the front door, no one followed. I had an old sedan that barely ran, something I had bought for a few $100s from a neighbor. The engine rattled, and sometimes the passenger window refused to close. But that car became my home for the next few months. I drove to the parking lot behind the 24-hour grocery store because it felt safe enough, brightly lit and always busy. I reclined the seat as far as it would go, shoved my backpack under my knees, and tried to sleep. My hearing loss made some things easier. The constant hum of traffic blurred into a soft wash of sound, almost like white noise. But every time someone walked by or a cart rattled too close, my body tensed. In the mornings, I washed up in a gas station restroom using paper towels and cold water. I learned to keep my hair neat, my clothes clean, to make sure no one guessed I was living out of my car. I did my homework in the public library, where the quiet was a relief. I ate cheap sandwiches and apples because they were easy to store. There was one librarian, Maribel Knox, who noticed I was spending long hours there. She was in her 60s, with silver hair she wore in a braid, and glasses that slid down her nose. She never asked directly, But she would bring over extra study guides or offer a granola bar when she walked through the aisles. She talked to me about college, about possibility, about how some kids just have heavier loads than others. She never tried to fix anything. She simply made the space feel less lonely. School itself became my anchor. I arrived early so I could use the bathrooms before they got crowded. I stayed late to finish assignments while I still had access to power outlets. No one at school knew what was happening. I did not tell anyone because I did not want pity or questions. I wanted to survive long enough to graduate. The nights were the hardest. Spokane gets cold even before winter truly settles in. Some evenings, the temperature dropped so low I could see my breath inside the car. I kept an extra blanket in the trunk, something I had taken from home years earlier. I wrapped it around myself and waited for the sun to rise. My dad never called. My mom never sent a message. No one checked if I needed help or if I was alive. Days stretched into weeks, then into months. The silence became its own answer. I told myself I should not be surprised. They had spent years teaching me how to adjust to them, not the other way around. But even with that understanding, the absence was its own kind of wound. It carved out a space inside me where the idea of family used to be. Still, I kept moving. I applied for every scholarship I could find. I saved every dollar from my job at the small grocery store. I studied until my eyes burned. I pushed through exhaustion because I could not afford to fail. I believed that if I could get to college, everything might shift. Not with my family, but within myself. Sometimes I parked near the riverfront because the sound of water made it easier to sleep. Sometimes I parked behind the high school, pretending I was waiting for someone. I learned which lots had cameras and which ones were ignored. I learned how to fold my life into the space between the steering wheel and the back seat. One evening in early winter, I saw my dad driving slowly down the main road near the grocery store. For a second, my heart leapt, thinking he might be looking for me. His truck passed my parked car without slowing. He did not turn his head. He did not notice. I remember gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles hurt. I do not know how long I sat there staring at the taillights fading into the distance. Later, I heard through a neighbor that my mom had told people I was staying with a friend for a while, that I needed space, that everything was fine. My sister posted holiday photos online with captions about family time and blessings. I was not in a single picture. The holidays passed in silence. New Year's came and went. School resumed. Life continued. I kept showing up to class, to work, to the library. I kept my head down and held my breath. On the coldest nights, when my fingertips went numb even under the blanket, I wondered how long I could keep going. But stopping was not an option. I wanted a life that did not depend on pleasing people who barely saw me. I wanted something solid, something no one could push me out of. By the time graduation approached, I had enough scholarship money and savings to afford community college classes. Maribel slipped a small card into one of my textbooks on my last day in the library. It held a short note that said, "Keep going. The world is bigger than the one you came from." I kept that card for years. What I learned during those months was not something I could have understood earlier. Silence can be louder than shouting. Absence can be its own kind of verdict. And independence is not always chosen. Sometimes it is forced on you when the door closes behind you and no one opens it. Again. Years later, when the lawsuit papers were filed, those months became evidence. Dates, addresses, school records, employment logs, a timeline that matched exactly what I had lived. In the legal filings, it was called early emancipation and lack of parental support. On paper, it looked clinical and factual. But the truth underneath it was simpler. I was 17. I needed a family. And no one came looking. That was the part the courtroom would eventually see. Though my dad never imagined those nights in the car would resurface in a place he could not control. Before I ever built a company or signed a contract or took out a loan, I learned how to survive with nothing but a rusted sedan, a backpack, and a stubborn belief that the life I had been pushed out of was not the only one available to me. Those months carved out the edges of who I would become. They hardened some parts, softened others, and taught me a truth I did not want at the time, but would rely on later. What a person chooses to do with their silence can reveal more than anything they say out loud. And the silence my family gave me became the foundation for everything that came next. When I left Spokane Community College after my first semester, I was carrying a backpack, a used laptop, and the kind of determination that grows only when survival has already become familiar. I transferred to Eastern Washington University because it was close enough to work, part-time, but far enough that no one could drive by and pretend not to see me again. I rented a small room in a house shared with other students and learned quickly how to stretch groceries for a week, how to study during lunch breaks, and how to make exhaustion feel like background noise. College was not easy for me, not academically and not socially. Lecture halls were loud, and my mild hearing loss made it hard to keep up when professors walked around while talking. I sat in the front row because it was the only way I could catch everything, even if it made me feel exposed. On bad days, when the audio systems crackled or students whispered behind me, I had to remind myself that I had slept in a car and made it through. I could make it through this, too. I worked part-time in the campus IT department, answering questions about forgotten passwords and computers that would not turn on. I liked the calm instructions, the logic, and the steady pace. It made sense in a way people rarely had. Technology did not get irritated if you needed something repeated. It did not sigh or tell you that you were making a big deal out of nothing. It simply responded to the input it received. I graduated in 2018 with a degree in information systems and a stack of student loans that felt like another mountain I had to climb. Around the time I was interviewing for jobs, I checked my phone one evening and saw a family group text that had been started without me months earlier. I was suddenly added back into it. My sister had posted pictures from a vacation in Malibu, posing with friends beside a rented convertible. My parents sent heart emojis and comments about living life to the fullest. Below those photos, my dad wrote a message directed at me that said, "It must be nice when you do not have real responsibilities yet." I stared at that message for a long time. At that moment, my bank account had $38 in it, and I was counting down the days until my next paycheck. I did not respond. I muted the conversation and went back to rewriting my resume. I accepted my first full-time job at a small technology firm in Spokane. The pay was modest, but the opportunity felt huge. I was assigned to back-end systems and automation, work that I loved. I stayed late without being asked, not because I wanted to prove myself, but because I genuinely enjoyed understanding why things broke and how they could be rebuilt to run more smoothly. Within a year, I had saved enough to rent a studio apartment, something small with thin walls and an old heater, but entirely my own. I bought used furniture and a tiny dining table from a thrift store. The first meal I ate there alone was macaroni from a box, and I remember thinking how strange it was to feel both lonely and deeply safe at the same time. My family did not visit. They did not ask about my job. They did not ask how school had gone or where I was living, but every few months, they would post pictures online. My mom is smiling in front of a new kitchen remodel. My dad is standing beside a new truck. My sister posing with designer shopping bags. The captions always said things like gratitude and family blessings. One holiday season, I went to their house for dinner because my mom insisted. By then, I was paying down student loans aggressively and working occasional freelance contracts to get ahead. When I arrived, my sister was giving a tour of her latest photo shoot setup in the living room, ring lights positioned like she was preparing for an interview with the magazine. My dad nodded at me without getting up from the recliner. He told me jobs in technology must pay pretty well if I could afford to ignore the family. Then he asked how much I made, not as a conversation starter, but as a measurement. When I hesitated, he said, "We are family. We should know these things." I changed the subject. My mom spent the evening complimenting my sister's online presence and asking if I could help her set up a website that would make her more discoverable. My sister barely acknowledged me, except to mention how difficult it was living in a world where people expected content creators to work for free. I left after dessert and cried in the car for a moment from the sheer weight of recognizing that their interest had nothing to do with me and everything to do with what I could provide. I poured myself into work after that night. I absorbed new skills. I stayed late. I volunteered for challenging projects. I watched the inefficiencies inside the company and realized that a better solution could be built from scratch. Something smarter. Something adaptive. Something I could create without having to answer to anyone. I started building a prototype of what would become Grayline Systems in the early months of 2019. At first, it was just a side project, a concept for automated back-end management using layered scripts and predictive load handling. I coded on weekends and long into the night, sitting on the floor of my studio apartment with cold coffee and a notebook full of diagrams. By summer, I filed the paperwork to open the company. Grayline Systems started as a registered business with no office, no employees, and no real funding. Just me. I built the website myself. I pitched small businesses. I sent cold emails. I learned quickly that rejection was not personal, or at least it did not feel personal, after everything I had experienced earlier in my life. My first client was a small logistics firm. They needed system automation and monitoring tools. I charged far less than I should have, but it got my foot in the door. They recommended me to a regional manufacturing company, then a real estate developer. The referrals spread faster than I imagined. I hired my first contractor for a project in late 2019, and my second by spring of the next year. Grayline Systems grew out of the tiny apartment and into a rented office space that I painted myself. I bought a desk, then another. I upgraded my laptop. I hired 3 part-time engineers. For the first time, I felt the ground under me solidify. My family did not congratulate me. They did not ask questions. They did not ask how I had done it. But my mom did start calling to ask small favors. Could I help my dad install a new router? Could I talk to my sister about building her an app for her influencer work? Could I look at a bill and see if it was normal for their cable company to charge so much? There were moments when I wondered whether this was how connection began again, through small requests and simple conversations. But beneath each request, there was a thread I could not ignore. It felt less like reaching out and more like pulling me back into a role I no longer occupied. The real change came the year Grayline Systems crossed its first $1 million in revenue. I had not told anyone in my family. I did not post about it. I did not celebrate publicly. But word has a way of traveling, especially in hometowns where people talk to neighbors and neighbors talk to relatives, and relatives talk to people they should not. One afternoon, I received a text from my dad that said, "Things are going well for you. Proud of you." Then a second text arrived before I could respond. "You should come by more often. We are still family." My stomach tightened when I read it, because those words had never been sent during the years when I slept in a car, when I juggled work and classes, when I scraped by on $10 grocery budgets. They were sent only after my name became attached to something valuable. The calls increased. The messages increased. My sister posted a picture with a caption that said, "Supporting local entrepreneurs," and tagged my company as if we had been collaborating. My mom began asking about my health, my stress, my sleep. She wanted to know if I had time for family dinners. She wanted to hear about my projects, even though she barely understood the industry. It was gentle, sweet even, but it sat on me like a weight. When people who have never shown curiosity suddenly begin asking questions, it can feel like affection. Or it can feel like reconnaissance. One evening, my dad stopped by my apartment without warning. He stood in the hallway, hands in his coat pockets, and said he wanted to see how I was doing. I invited him out of habit, though the air felt strange between us. He looked around the room, noted the furniture, the framed certificate on the wall, and the work equipment. He nodded like he was taking inventory. He said it was good to see I had made something of myself. Then he asked if I could help my sister with a financial issue she was having. I told him I did not think that was a good idea. He frowned. He said families help each other. The shift back to obligation happened so fast, it almost knocked the air out of me. I declined again, more firmly this time. He left shortly after. The next day, my sister posted a vague message about people changing when they get money. My mom left a sad face on it. That was the moment I understood the truth. My family did not want a relationship with me. They wanted proximity to what I had built. They wanted the image of success without the responsibility of the connection. They wanted control again, wrapped in the language of concern. For a while, I wondered if this was the best version of the relationship I would ever have. Polite conversations, conditional affection, requests disguised as check-ins. But each interaction tightened something inside me, something I had thought I left behind years earlier. By the time Grayline Systems reached its third year, I stopped expecting my family to change. I accepted that their interest was tied to financial value, not emotional connection. What I did not expect was how quickly that interest would turn into pressure, then resentment, then something far more damaging. The return of their control did not arrive as anger. It arrived as sweetness, concern, nostalgia. It arrived in the tone people use when they want you to feel guilty for living a life they did not give you permission to build. And before long, it arrived in accusations, cloaked as conversations, in passive remarks about responsibility and loyalty, in comparisons between my achievements and my sister's struggles. It would take only one holiday, one table full of relatives, and one sentence spoken too loudly to turn that pressure into a rupture I could not repair. But that night was still ahead of me, waiting like a storm on the horizon, gathering speed even as I convinced myself it could still pass quietly. The return of their control did not arrive as anger. It arrived as sweetness, concern, nostalgia. It arrived in the tone people use when they want you to feel guilty for living a life they did not give you permission to build. And before long, it arrived in accusations, cloaked as conversations, in passive remarks about responsibility and loyalty, in comparisons between my achievements and my sister's struggles. It would take only one holiday, one table full of relatives, and one sentence spoken too loudly to turn that pressure into a rupture I could not repair. But before that night came, there was a slow, steady shift. And it began with the words, "Family helps family." The first time my dad said that phrase to me as an adult, he said it with a smile. I remember the moment clearly because it came out of nowhere. I had stopped by their house after dropping off a package at a nearby store. My mom had invited me in for coffee, and I said yes, believing maybe this time things might be light and easy. We sat in the kitchen, my mom stirring cream into her mug, my dad reading something on his phone. My sister was upstairs, filming one of her short videos for her social media feed. I could hear her voice drifting down the stairs, rehearsed, bright, trying to sound effortless. My mom looked at me over her cup and said my sister had been struggling with her equipment. Her camera needed upgrading. Her lights were old. The editing software was too expensive. She explained it all gently, the way someone lists grievances without admitting they are complaints. Then she asked if I might be able to help. I thought she meant help as in advice or troubleshooting. I started to ask what exactly was wrong with the equipment, but my dad set his phone down and said, "Family helps family." He said it like the conclusion to an argument no one had made yet. I asked what he meant. He gave me a look that tightened something inside my chest. He said I was in a position to support my sister now, that it would not take much, that it was the right thing to do. He reminded me that my mom had sacrificed a lot to raise us. He reminded me that he had worked long hours to keep the family afloat. He reminded me that opportunities should be shared. While he spoke, my mom nodded along, her expression a mixture of sadness and expectation. I asked them directly what they were asking for. My mom hesitated. My dad did not. He said my sister needed about $2,000 to upgrade her equipment and create a better content studio. He said it would help her build her career. He said it was our responsibility to lift each other up. I felt the old pressure closing in again, that familiar weight of being told my worth depended on how much I could endure without causing trouble. I took a breath and tried to explain. I told them I could help my sister plan a budget or find financing options. I told them I could sit down with her and figure out what equipment she truly needed. But I said I could not simply give her the money, not because I did not care, but because walking into that dynamic again felt like losing something I had fought hard to build. My dad's expression changed slowly, like a cloud moving across the sun. He said I was being difficult. He said I had forgotten how hard things were for my sister. He said she had dreams too, and that, unlike me, she did not have a stable foundation to build on. I reminded him that stability was not something I had been given either. I reminded him where I had slept when I was 17. My dad looked at me as if I had said something inappropriate. He said that was in the past, that we had all moved on. I realized then that he had moved on long before I ever did. My sister came downstairs at that moment, her hair curled, her makeup flawless, her voice full of confidence. She asked if we were talking about the equipment situation. She said she was sure I would help because that is what family does. I told her I could help her plan, not fund. Her smile vanished. My dad cleared his throat. My mom touched her necklace the way she always did when she felt something slipping, out of her control. My sister said maybe I did not understand how the industry worked. She said influencers had to invest in their craft. She said she had already put so much into this dream, and she just needed one person in the family to believe in her. I told her belief was not the issue. Accountability was. She blinked at me as if I had said something offensive. My dad repeated the phrase again. Family helps family. He said it slower this time, as though I had missed something the first time around. That night on the drive home, the words kept echoing in my mind. Family helps family. But the truth was, that phrase had never applied equally. It was never about mutual support. It was about expectation, obligation, and sometimes control hidden beneath sentiment. Over the next month, that phrase became the soundtrack to every conversation with my family. Whenever my sister complained about a brand not paying her enough or a collaboration falling through, my mom would sigh and say, "Sometimes we sacrifice for the people we love." She said it while looking at me, not her. My dad began dropping hints that my success made me responsible for making sure my sister did not fall behind. He said life was not fair, and that those with more had to give more. He said I was lucky, and that luck came with duty. One evening at my apartment, I invited them for dinner because I still believed some part of the relationship could be salvaged. I made roasted chicken and vegetables. I cleaned the place thoroughly. I bought a bottle of wine I could barely afford. My sister walked in wearing a new coat and carrying a designer bag. My dad sat down and immediately asked how business was going. My mom told me the chicken was dry before she finished her first bite. The room felt small, like it was shrinking around me. Then my dad leaned back in his chair and said he hoped I would step up soon. He said my sister needed a proper investment to help her career take off. He used the same tone he had used when I was a child and needed reminding of my chores. My sister nodded, as if reinforcing a family rule. I told them calmly that if my sister wanted to start a real business, she could write a formal proposal, outline her budget, and show projections. I said I would consider helping her with planning or connecting her with resources, but I would not hand over money for a studio she could not sustain. My dad stared at me as if I were a stranger. He asked when I became so cold. My mom touched my hand and said gently that sometimes people lose themselves when they get successful. My sister said I had changed. The word hung between us, familiar and heavy, like something I had heard before. My dad repeated it. You have changed. This time, the phrase hit me differently. It did not feel like criticism. It felt like an accusation. It felt like the return of something I had spent years escaping. I looked at all three of them across my small dining table, the food untouched, the wine glass filled, but ignored. I saw in their faces not concern or disappointment. I saw expectations. I saw entitlement. I saw the belief that everything I built belonged to the family story they had been telling themselves long before I ever found my own footing. My dad said I used to be grateful. My mom said I used to understand sacrifice. My sister said she did not know who I was anymore. The room was silent for a long time after that. I cleaned the plates while they sat awkwardly in the living room. When they left, my dad patted my shoulder and said, "Think about what we said. Families rise together or fall together." When the door closed behind them, the quiet felt like something collapsing inside me. Not the silence of my childhood, not the silence of being overlooked or pushed aside, but a new silence, a silence that came from seeing clearly. Their concern was not concern. Their worry was not love. Their requests were not requests. They were demands dressed in sentiment. In the following weeks, I kept my distance. I answered calls when I felt strong enough. I responded to text politely but briefly. My sister continued posting online about her journey as an influencer. My mom sent messages asking if I was working too hard. My dad tried to stop by again, but I was not home. Then, one evening in late autumn, I received a voicemail from my dad. His voice sounded frustrated, almost offended. He said he did not understand why I was pulling away. He said I was treating my family like strangers. He said success had gone to my head. He said I had changed. It was the same phrase again. Not descriptive, not reflective. A verdict. In that moment, sitting alone in my apartment as the streetlights glowed through the thin curtains, I realized something with a clarity that made my breath catch. When my dad said, "You have changed," he did not mean I had become unkind or unrecognizable. He meant I had stopped being manageable. That was the truth underneath the phrase. Change meant I was no longer someone they could shape, adjust, or control. Change meant I had stepped out of the role they had assigned and built something that existed outside their narrative. And people rarely forgive the freedom they did not give you. The next holiday was approaching, and tension was building like a storm waiting to break. But I did not know yet how far they would go, or how deeply they believed I owed them more than I had ever owed myself. That realization would not come until the night my dad stood at the head of the Christmas table and turned disappointment into accusation, and accusation into something far more damaging. But the true rupture did not arrive at that dinner. It came quietly, tucked inside an ordinary envelope on an ordinary morning, changing the shape of my life with the simplest words in black ink. I remember the exact moment it happened because there was nothing special about the day itself. It was late January in Spokane, cold enough that my breath fogged as I stepped outside to grab the mail. I was wearing the same gray sweater I always wore when the office heater struggled. I collected the stack of flyers and letters without paying attention until I saw a thick white envelope with my full name printed in bold. The return address was a law office downtown. I did not think much of it. Grayline Systems had contracts, vendor agreements, non-disclosure forms. Legal envelopes were not unusual. I carried everything inside and dropped the pile onto the kitchen counter. I opened the envelope casually, expecting some updated paperwork for one of my clients. Then I saw it. Plaintiff, Raymond L. Harper. Defendant, M. Harper. Nature of action. Claim for constructive family obligation and financial damages. I stared at those words longer than I should have. The letters blurred slightly before snapping back into focus. My dad's name in the plaintiff line felt unreal, like a misprint, like a mistake someone would correct if I just blinked long enough. I read it again. Then again. Plaintiff. Dad. For a few seconds, everything went silent, except the faint hum of the refrigerator. It was the kind of silence that comes not from peace, but from impact, like sound has been knocked out of the room. I sat down at the table because my legs felt shaky. My first instinct was that this had to be a misunderstanding, a clerical error. Someone typed the wrong name. Some letter meant for someone else had been misdelivered. But the case number was real. The signature was real. The accusations were real. My dad had filed a lawsuit claiming that my refusal to financially support her sister's influencer career had caused her lost opportunities, emotional damages, and financial setbacks. He argued that I had benefited from the family's sacrifices and therefore owed them, family, a shared portion of the success I built. He listed my company's assets. He listed my personal savings. He listed estimates of the potential earnings my sister could have achieved if only I had contributed. The number he demanded was half of Grayline Systems, 50% of something he had not built, had not contributed to, had not even asked to understand. The room felt colder. My ears buzzed with that uneven ringing I had known since childhood, the kind that creeps in when loud moments become sharp and unbearable. I pressed my palms to the table and tried to steady my breathing. I read the final line of the claim. The plaintiff seeks equitable redistribution of assets and reparative damages based on family obligation. Family obligation. The phrase followed me like a shadow. I do not know how long I sat there before I pulled out my phone. I searched for a local attorney who handled complex civil matters. The first name I found with strong reviews was Grant Holloway. His assistant answered on the third ring. I explained, or tried to explain, what had happened. She scheduled a consultation for the next morning and told me to bring the paperwork. That night, I barely slept. My mind kept circling the same questions. What had pushed my dad to do this? Why now? Who convinced him? Whether he had drafted this claim with intention or with anger or with something far stranger. In the morning, I drove to the law office downtown, gripping the envelope so tightly the edges bent. Grant Holloway was in his late 40s, tall, with calm eyes, and a voice that did not rise even when discussing difficult topic. He invited me to sit and asked me to walk him through everything. I handed him the papers. He skimmed the first page and raised his eyebrows slightly. By the third page, he let out a breath and leaned back in his chair. He asked if I had been financially supporting my sister. I said no. He asked if I had ever signed any agreement promising to support her. I said no. He asked if my family had provided any financial support to my company. I said absolutely not. He continued reading, turning each page slowly until he finished the last one and set the stack down carefully. He said the case was weak, very weak, legally unsound. He explained that the claim of constructive family obligation was not a recognized contractual structure in Washington state, nor was the implied sharing of adult earnings between family members. He said the filing read more like a personal grievance than a legal argument, but he did not smile. He did not joke. He did not dismiss it casually. He said weak lawsuits can still be harmful. They drain time, money, and emotional resources. They escalate conflict. They create public records. They are not always able to win. Sometimes they are hurt. He tapped the plaintiff line with one finger and said quietly, "This is not about legal strategy. This is about leverage." I asked him what that meant. He said people who file cases like this are usually desperate or manipulated or both. He said the details looked personal and reactive. He said someone had convinced my dad that this was his only way to reclaim something he believed he had lost. He told me we would fight it. He told me not to communicate with my family directly. He told me to focus on facts, not emotion. But then he paused, studying my face carefully. He asked me when I had last spoken to my dad. I told him about Christmas dinner. He nodded slowly, as if the pieces were clicking into place. Then he said something that changed how I saw the entire situation. He said your dad did not file this because he is angry. He filed this because he feels owed. There is a difference. Anger fades. Entitlement grows. Those words landed heavily because they felt true, in a way that resonated with years of unspoken dynamics. My dad had never apologized for the night I left home. He had never apologized for the silence that followed. He had never acknowledged the imbalance between his expectations and my reality. But he had carried something all along, a belief that my achievements were built on foundations he laid, even if he had not been there when the ground beneath me collapsed. Grant asked me if I felt safe. I said yes, though my voice was not as steady as I wanted it to be. He gave me a list of documents to gather. Employment records from when I was 17, financial statements, business formation documents, anything that showed the years I spent building without support. He asked if I thought my mom knew about the lawsuit. I said I did not know. He asked if I thought my sister played a role. I said I truly did not know how deep her influence went, but I knew she had been increasingly vocal about her belief that I owed her help. He nodded again, as if filing away each detail. Before I left, he told me something practical that somehow made my stomach drop. He said discovery would reveal more than the initial claim. He said family financial records would come into play. He said it was likely that the lawsuit was connected to something beneath them. Surface. People do not risk everything for small grievances. They risk everything when they feel cornered. I drove home in a fog. My apartment felt unfamiliar, as if the floor plan had shifted in my absence. I held the envelope again and read the first line one more time. Plaintiff. Dad. There are moments in life when reality rearranges itself instantly, when a truth you never imagined becomes fact with no warning. This was one of those moments. The world did not look the same once I knew my own dad had taken legal action to claim half of the company I built from years of grit and solitude. I thought of the nights I slept in my car, in the mornings I washed up in gas station restrooms, the days I stretched groceries to make it through the week, the nights I studied until my eyes burned, all the moments my family could have called or asked or reached out but chose silence instead. None of that mattered now. Not to them. Not in this case. To them, Gray Line Systems was family property because I was family property. I sat at my small dining table again, just as I had the night I opened the envelope. The edges of the papers curled slightly where I had held them too tight. My chest felt hollow and heavy at the same time. It was not anger I felt. Not then. It was recognition. My dad was not punishing me. He was claiming to be me, claiming what he believed was his. Claiming the parts of my life he had never helped build. This lawsuit was not the eruption of a conflict. It was the culmination of years of expectation and entitlement rising to the surface. As the winter afternoon faded into evening and the light shifted through the window, I realized something with a clarity that steadied me in a way nothing else could. My family was not fighting me. They were trying to rewrite the past. They were trying to turn obligation into debt and independence into betrayal, and they were willing to weaponize the law to do it. I did not know then how much discovery would reveal. I did not know what financial secrets lay beneath their accusations. I did not know how far this would go, or how much would unravel. All I knew was that the next step would take the truth out of the shadows, and once that happened, nothing about our family would ever look the same again. Everything began to tilt the moment discovery opened. Up until then, the lawsuit felt like an insult. A betrayal, a twisted attempt to claim ownership of my work. But once the documents arrived, once Grant spread them across the long conference table in his office, I realized I had been looking at only the surface of something much darker. I remember sitting down across from him, the blinds half drawn against a pale February morning in Spokane. He had a folder thicker than anything I expected. He did not speak right away. He simply opened it and let the pages settle between us like the weight of a new truth. He said my dad's financial disclosures were included, along with my mom's joint accounts. He had already skimmed them, but he wanted me to see everything myself. I nodded and reached for the first stack. It took only a few lines before my stomach tightened. There were multiple refinance records on their house, at least 3 within the last 7 years. Each time, the mortgage amount grew, while the available equity shrank. I followed the numbers slowly, trying to understand the pattern. It was not just maintenance. It was not emergency repairs or medical bills. It was something else entirely. The next set of documents were credit card statements. Pages and pages of them. Charge from luxury retailers, salon appointments, high-end restaurants, airline tickets, resort stays, a membership at a premium golf club that cost more per year than I used to make as much, a college student working night shifts. Grant watched my face carefully. He asked me to take my time. I flipped through the pages, the buzz in my ears growing tighter. I saw a charge for a week-long stay at a resort in Arizona, another for a cruise package, a set of first-class tickets to New York City. There were designer handbags, spa treatments, subscription boxes, a full year of payments for a meal delivery service I had never heard them mention. And then there were payments to my sister. Not small ones. Transfers labeled business support, equipment reimbursement, collaboration expenses. Amounts large enough to make me blink. I sat back in my chair, the papers trembling slightly between my fingers. It did not make sense. My dad had always preached about frugality, about responsibility, about saving every penny. He had lectured me endlessly about needing to toughen up and handle life on my own. He had mocked people who lived above their means. So why this? Grant pulled another set of forms from the folder. These were debt consolidation documents, several of them. The totals were staggering. He told me quietly that my parents were carrying more debt than most families, earned in a year. My mouth went dry. It felt like something cold was spreading through my chest. He asked if I had any idea they were struggling financially. I shook my head. My parents had always presented their lives as stable, comfortable, respectable. My dad used to brag about being smart with money. My mom used to say they never needed help from anyone. I turned to another page. It was a summary of loan applications submitted over the past few years. Some were denied. Others were approved with high interest. A few listed projected household income that did not match anything they had ever told me. There was one line that made me stop breathing. Proposed collateral. Future support from adult children. Anticipated in assets or cash. I asked Grant what that meant. He said in plain terms that they had applied for financing with the implication that I would eventually bail them out. They had written my existence into their financial planning, not as a daughter, but as a resource. I closed my eyes for a moment and saw flashes of the past year, the sudden sweetness in their tone, the invitations, the pressure about family helps family, the guilt mixed into every conversation, the way my dad had insisted I support my sister's career, the way my mom had smiled tightly when I said no. It was not about my sister at all. She was just the visible excuse, the softened edge of a much sharper truth. The real problem was the debt, the vacations, the lifestyle built on borrowed money, and the expectation that I would eventually inherit their obligations whether I wanted to or not. My dad's lawsuit claiming 50% of my company was not a punishment. It was a salvage attempt. They had run out of places to borrow from. I leaned forward and reread the refinance documents. Each time, the mortgage increased. Each time, the justification became more vague. The last refinance listed home improvement as the purpose. But I knew that house. There were no major renovations. The kitchen looked the same. The flooring had not changed in years. The roof had been replaced once, but that had been covered by insurance. I whispered to myself, without meaning to. This was all planned. Grant nodded grimly. He said discovery often reveals motivations people never admit out loud. He said my dad's lawsuit was not rooted in legal logic, but financial desperation. He said the entitlement I had been feeling was only the emotional surface of a more practical motive. They needed money, a lot of it, and fast. I asked him why they did not come to me directly. He raised one eyebrow. He said they did, many times, but I had said no. He let the words sit for a moment. I looked down at the papers again, and something inside me shifted. All the confusion from Christmas dinners suddenly sharpened into clarity. My dad yelled across the table that I had abandoned my sister. My mom's silence, my sister's entitlement. All of it now made sense. They were not rejecting me. They were cornering me. They were building a case long before the lawsuit ever appeared. Every sentence about obligation, every sigh about sacrifice, every pointed remark that I had changed. It was all part of a structure I never realized they were assembling. I said nothing for a while. My ears buzzed in that uneven way they do when too much crashes in. The room felt distant, as though the air between me and the table had thickened. Grant pushed another paper toward me gently. It was a spreadsheet summarizing my parents' annual expenses. The total was larger than anything I expected. He pointed to one line in particular. Annual golf club membership. It cost more than 3 months of my early rent combined. It hit me then. They were not asking for help. They were asking to be rescued without admitting they needed rescue. My dad did not sue me because he believed I wronged my sister. He sued me because their financial life had collapsed behind closed doors, and I was the last remaining option. The fallback plan, the safety net they believed belonged to them. I asked Grant if he thought my sister knew about all this. He paused respectfully before answering. He said she likely knew part of it, not all. He said people used as reasons in lawsuits often are not told the truth. Sometimes they are weaponized by omission. I felt a tightness in my chest again. Not heartbreak, not anger. Recognition. My family had always seen me as the one who would be fine, the one who could handle things, the one who did not need much. They had turned that into a financial principle. I flipped through more statements, searching for something that might contradict what I was beginning to understand. But everything pointed in the same direction. Excess, avoidance, debt rising like water, and beneath it all, an unspoken expectation that, eventually, I would step in. My dad had not filed the lawsuit out of rage. He filed it out of certainty. Certainty that the court would pressure me into settling. Certainty that guilt would wear me down. Certainty that my success existed for their benefit. The deeper I read, the colder the truth became. I was not their daughter in this lawsuit. I was their asset. When I finally spoke again, my voice sounded strange even to me. I asked Grant what our next step was. He said we would prepare for depositions and financial tracing. He said the numbers were in our favor. He said judges do not take kindly to lawsuits filed out of entitlement. But then he said something I was not prepared for. He said people who reach this level of desperation often escalate. He told me to brace myself emotionally. He told me to expect more manipulation, more guilt, more mixed messages. He said this was not just a legal fight. It was a family unraveling. I left his office with a copy of the documents tucked in a folder. The winter air outside felt sharper than before. On the drive home, every memory of my parents took on a different color. The brightness of childhood dimmed. The moments of shame and obligation looked clearer. Even the silence after I left home at 17 suddenly made a cruel kind of sense. By the time I reached my apartment, I knew the truth. They had not sued me because they believed I owed them something. They had sued me because without me, their entire life would collapse. I carried the folder inside and set it on the table. The same table where I had once opened the envelope announcing the lawsuit. The same table where I had cried silently after Christmas dinner. The same table where I had tried to convince myself this was all a misunderstanding. But now there was no misunderstanding left. I was the last buoy they could hold on to. And the moment I saw that clearly, everything about this fight changed. That was the moment the air in the room seemed to shift. The moment the lawsuit stopped being an emotional wound and became something else entirely. The moment everything about my family changed color was the moment I knew the courtroom would not just be a place of judgment, it would be a place of revelation. And I walked into it carrying that certainty like a quiet, steady weight inside my chest. The courthouse in downtown Spokane was colder than I expected, the kind of cold that seeped into your sleeves and made you feel smaller, no matter how prepared you thought you were. I sat beside Grant in the second row, facing the long wooden tables where each side would present their case. My dad sat across from us with his attorney, a man I'd never met. My mom sat behind him, hands clasped in her lap, staring straight ahead as though pretending she had nothing to do with any of this. My sister was not there. I did not know if they had asked her to come or if she had chosen not to. In a strange way, her absence felt fitting. So much of this story had been built around her, and yet none of it truly started with her. Judge Conrad Whitmore entered promptly at 9 o'clock. He was in his early 60s, tall, with a direct way of looking at people that made you feel as though he could see straight through whatever rehearsed story you planned to tell. He took his seat, glanced at both tables, and opened the case file. There were no long introductions, no dramatic statements, just the sound of paper shifting as Judge Whitmore reviewed the stack of documents in front of him. My dad's attorney stood and began the opening argument. He talked about sacrifice, about family, about years of unacknowledged support. He described my sister's lost opportunities with a confidence that surprised me. He used phrases like emotional burden and family duty and generational reciprocity. He said I had benefited from the foundation my parents built. Therefore, I was obligated to help preserve that foundation. He spoke as though he were telling a moral story instead of presenting a legal claim. Then, my dad stood. Seeing him there, speaking to the judge with the same voice he once used to lecture me as a teenager, sent a strange ache through my chest. He talked about what he believed he had given me. He talked about how children owe their parents respect. He talked about how he was disappointed by what he called my abandonment of my sister. He said he had never asked me for much, only to help the family during hard times. He did not mention the vacations, the golf membership, the refinance documents, the credit card charges, the debt that had been piling up like a shadow beneath their lives. He mentioned only duty, only sacrifice, only expectation. I watched him while he spoke. His jaw was tight, his voice steady at first, then straining with emotion. My mom kept her eyes down. She never looked at me, not once. Grant leaned toward me slightly and whispered that I did not need to react. He said silence could be powerful. So I stayed quiet, hands folded in my lap, breathing slowly, letting everything wash over me without showing what it did inside. When my dad finished, his attorney gestured toward the exhibits, folders thick with statements and accusations. The judge nodded absently and kept turning the pages in the file. Grant stood only briefly. He did not lecture. He did not accuse. He stated simply what the documents revealed. He described my history in plain terms. He detailed the lack of any financial agreement. He pointed out the refinance patterns and the luxury spending. He spoke about accountability without using the word. Then he sat back down. Judge Whitmore closed the file for a moment and looked at my dad. He did not smile. He did not frown. He simply studied him. Then he asked one question, a question that made the whole room still. He asked if my parents had ever provided financial support for my company, even $1. My dad hesitated. His attorney cleared his throat. My dad finally said no. The judge nodded slightly and continued. He asked if I had ever signed any agreement promising to share my earnings with the family. Again, my dad said no, though this time the word came out almost as a whisper. The judge turned a page in the file and read quietly for several seconds. The room was silent, except for the soft hum of the ventilation system. Then he lifted his head. He said this lawsuit was not built on legal grounds. It was built on expectation. He said courts do not enforce expectations. They enforce law. My dad's shoulders tensed. Judge Whitmore tapped the documents gently and continued. He said the filings revealed significant debt and discretionary spending. He said nothing in the record showed financial support provided to me during the years I built my company. He said the narrative of sacrifice presented did not match the financial evidence. Then he delivered the sentence that cut through the room like a blade of cold air. He said, what you are asking this court to do is take the success your daughter earned through hardship and turn it into payment for choices you refuse to take responsibility for. The words landed with such clarity that no one moved. My dad's face went pale. My mom pressed her hand to her mouth. My dad tried to speak, but nothing came out. His attorney reached for his arm, but he pulled away. Judge Whitmore continued in the same calm tone, saying the lawsuit was dismissed in full. He said the court would not entertain claims rooted in personal entitlement. He said this case should never have been filed. My dad stared down at the table, trembling slightly. His breathing became uneven. The room felt too quiet, as though everyone had been holding their breath and forgotten how to release it. Then something inside him seemed to collapse. His eyes filled suddenly, spilling over before he could stop it. He tried wiping his face, but the tears kept coming. He covered his mouth with one hand and stood abruptly, knocking his chair back. He stepped away from the table and left the room with uneven, hurried steps. No one spoke. Not the attorneys, not my mom, not even the judge. For several long seconds, the courtroom was suspended in a kind of stunned silence. My mom rose slowly and followed him out, her hand shaking as she reached for the door. Grant placed a hand on my arm, gentle but steady. He whispered that it was over. But it did not feel over. Not yet. Not when the truth had landed so hard that it broke something open we had never acknowledged before. I gathered my papers quietly, trying not to make noise in the stillness. Judge Whitmore had already moved on to the next file, but the words he spoke lingered in the air like a shadow that would not lift. When I stepped out into the hallway, the fluorescent lights felt too bright. The air felt too thin. My dad was nowhere in sight. My mom was not either. And for the first time since the lawsuit began, I realized something deeper than legal victory. The judgment had not only dismissed the case, it had stripped away the story my family had been using to justify their choices for years. When I stepped out of the courthouse that morning and felt the cold Spokane air hit my face, I thought the hardest part was done. I thought the legal judgment would be the final break, the clean ending, the moment everything finally went silent. But karma does not happen in clean lines. It unfolds like slow fog, inching in whether anyone watches or not. The first notice of asset seizure was delivered exactly 10 days after the ruling. I learned about it not because I was tracking the paperwork, but because a neighbor from my parents' old subdivision sent me a message saying a county truck had been in their driveway all morning. It felt surreal, hearing it from someone who once saw my family as the respectable couple who hosted summer cookouts, and decorated their yard for every holiday. The couple who bragged about their daughter's influencer career. The couple who rarely mentioned their older child, except to say she was busy with her tech company. By the end of that week, the second notice was issued. The house, the same house where I grew up trying to stay out of pictures and out of the way, was officially in foreclosure proceedings. I did not read the documents. Grant sent them, but I kept them unopened for 2 days before finally scanning them with a kind of numb detachment. Everything was listed in plain type. The refinance from 3 years earlier, the credit card consolidation loan, the luxury purchases that had continued even as the debt grew. It was all there, laid out without emotion. The next wave came quickly. Dad's golf membership was revoked. Mom's credit line froze. A repossession order for the SUV. The life they had built on borrowed comfort collapsed, one notice at a time, like dominoes tipping over in slow motion. I did not call them. They did not call me. Not yet. The first call came 32 days after the ruling. I remember the exact number because Grant had told me they would likely wait until the pressure reached a point where pride cracked. He said family desperation has a predictable rhythm. When my phone lit up with Dad's name, I let it ring until it went to voicemail. The message came through seconds later. He sounded smaller. Not weak, just smaller. He asked if we could talk. He said he understood things had gone too far. He said they were about to lose everything, and he needed my help. He said he was still my dad. I listened twice, trying to hear something beneath the words, but there was nothing there except fear and a quiet sense of entitlement, as if needing me meant I still owed them something. I did not call back. The next day, Mom called. She did not leave a voicemail, just hung up and called again, as though repetition itself might create obligation. The third call finally came with a message. Her voice cracked as she said they could not afford the medication her doctor had prescribed for her blood pressure. She said she did not know what they were going to do. She said families are supposed to take care of each other. I sat with that voicemail for a long time. Part of me wanted to feel something familiar, some echo of childhood instinct to try to fix things. But instinct had been burned out of me long ago, replaced by something steadier and clearer. When you spend years climbing out of a life built on quiet exclusion, you learn to stop mistaking guilt for responsibility. I did not call her back either. 2 days later, I received a text from my sister, just one line. "I'm sorry." I stared at it until the words blurred. My sister, the one who had posed in perfect lighting and learned to tilt her chin just so for every picture, was now living the kind of life no influencer would ever show. I had not seen her in months, and still, for a moment, I pictured her sitting in the dim corner of a too-small apartment, makeup removed, hair unstyled, holding her phone with both hands because even her fingers might be shaking. But I also knew her message was not a request for forgiveness. It was a request for relief, and I could not give her that. When Dad finally called again, he did not try to sound strong. He did not try to sound angry. He did not try to remind me of family history. He sounded exhausted. He said they had received the final notice. The house would be gone in less than 6 weeks. He asked if I could at least stop the seizure of the car so he could get to work. He said he was trying. I listened. I let him talk. I let him say every word that came into his throat. Then I told him the truth, the plain truth, the one I had carried since I was 17 years old and sleeping in my car while. He pretended not to notice my absence. I told him I was not doing this to punish him. I told him I was not taking revenge. I told him these were the consequences of choices he had made long before that lawsuit. I said the court had simply made them visible. He did not argue. He just breathed heavily on the other end, a sound that felt strangely familiar, like the way he used to sigh when he thought I had disappointed him, except now the disappointment was his own. He whispered that he understood. He thanked me for picking up the phone. Then he hung up. 3 weeks later, the house was emptied. Their furniture was sold. The SUV was towed from the complex where they were staying temporarily. They moved into a 2-bedroom rental on the edge of Spokane, a place with thin walls and old carpet, and windows that rattled in the wind. A place they never would have considered if they still had the life they wanted to, present to the world. I did not go there. I did not drive by. I did not ask Grant for updates. The information flowed to me anyway, through official letters and public records and the occasional message from someone who used to know our family. Every time I read something new, I felt neither triumph nor relief, only an unmoving clarity. Nothing that happened to them was because of me. It was because of years of pretending the math would fix itself, because of choices made in silence and hidden behind vacations, photos, and polite nods across holiday tables, because of the belief that consequences could be delayed forever. Karma is not loud. It does not rush. It arrives at its own pace, stepping through the open spaces people create for it without realizing they ever left the door unlocked. As their world contracted, mine did not expand in celebration. I kept going to work. I kept showing up for my team. I kept living in the home I built with my own hands and my own choices. I did not celebrate their downfall. I did not broadcast it. I did not take pleasure in hearing they struggled with bills or that Dad had lost his spot in the golf league he used to brag about. But I also did nothing to interrupt the process, because the moment you stop trying to save people from their own choices is the moment you finally understand where responsibility ends. They had lived the way they wanted. Now, they were living with what came next. I did not notice the quiet at first, not the real kind, the kind that sits beneath your skin. It showed up slowly, almost gently, in the nights after the courtroom, the notices, the phone calls that never came again. One evening, as I locked up the office at Gray Line Systems and stepped into the empty parking, it hit me that I was finally living without waiting for someone to yank the ground out from under me. The company was steady now, healthier than it had ever been. The team had grown, not because I wanted expansion for its own sake, but because I finally had room to choose the kind of work that felt solid and true. I still arrived early most mornings, parked my truck in the same spot, walked into the same building with the same sense of responsibility I carried when I was 22 and terrified of losing everything I had barely begun to build. Except now, the fear was gone. I worked because I wanted to, not because survival demanded it. My life had settled into its own rhythm in Spokane. A modest house in a quiet neighborhood, a backyard with 2 maple trees that turned a deep red every fall, a kitchen that finally had the space I never had growing up. Some nights, I cooked while listening to the soft hum of the dishwasher and felt so deeply anchored that it startled me. Nothing in my life was extravagant, but everything was mine. I had not spoken to my family since the last call from my dad. There were no holiday invitations, no sudden apologies, no attempts to repair anything. They moved into their rental on the north side and stayed there. I heard small things through public records and the occasional message from someone who still remembered our last name. But I did not respond. I did not follow their lives or their choices. I let the distance grow until it became natural. People assume no contact is an action, a line drawn in one sharp moment. But for me, it was softer than that. It was the absence of a pull, the silence after years of straining to prove my worth, the understanding that I was allowed to stop trying to carry a family that had never once tried to carry me. No drama, no confrontation, just an unspoken truth settling between us like untouched snow. One night, not long after the company signed a new multi-year contract, I arrived home later than usual. The sun had already dipped behind the houses across the street. I stood in my driveway for a moment, listening to the faint buzz of traffic in the distance, and realized my shoulders were finally relaxed. That was new. I could not remember the last time I had ended a day without bracing for the next blow. Inside, I fed the dog, answered a few emails, and took a shower. When I stepped into my bedroom, the lamp on the nightstand cast a warm glow across the room. My hearing aids were still in, small and discreet, sitting where they had been all day, filtering sound, grounding me in the world. I reached up and removed the left one first. The soft click of it releasing felt strangely symbolic. Then I removed the right one. The quiet that followed was not emptiness. It was released. A choice. A boundary I could touch with my own hands. For years, I had learned to adapt to noise I never asked for. The shouts, the guilt, the expectations disguised as love, letting the world dim just enough to let my mind breathe. It was not about shutting anything out. It was about making room for the life I had built entirely on my own. I sat on the edge of the bed and looked around my room. There were no family photographs on the walls, no forced memories on display, just pieces of a life shaped by survival and rebuilt with intention. I felt no anger, no bitterness, only the steady understanding that walking away had saved me long before the courtroom ever could. Sometimes people ask me if I regret cutting ties, if the judgment felt like too much, if I wonder whether things could have turned out differently. I do not answer with speeches or long explanations. I simply say that peace teaches you more than pain ever will. That is the truth I carry now. The last thing I did before lying down was place my hearing aids carefully in their small case. It was an ordinary action, but it held a quiet meaning. A reminder that I got to decide what voices entered my life and which ones stopped at my door. For the first time, that choice felt like belonging. Thank you for listening to my story. If you have ever been told you were too much or not enough for your own family, remember this: silence can be power, and truth can be the loudest revenge. Tell me in the comments what integrity means to you and where you are listening from.